Hello, I'm Dave Frykman. In this video, I'm going to show you how I carved, painted, and finished this little gnome, carved from a piece of eastern white cedar. Let's get started. I'm working here inside my carving booth. You could see that in the introduction. It was behind me when I held up the little Santa I'm making. The carving booth is very simple to build, and I've recommended it to a number of other carvers who've been able to build them, and it works well if you're using the kinds of tools that I use. As you can see here, I'm using a 4.5-inch grinder with a coarse piece of sandpaper. I believe it's a 50 grit paper on it, and it takes the cedar off as a fine powder, which would be really messy unless you had some really good way of dust collection. My carving booth is connected to a dust collector, so all of the dust is blown outside away from me. The glass front has a slot underneath it so I can see it, but my hands and arms are inside with the piece of wood and my tools. It's very effective for protecting me so I don't have to wear dust protection. I still wear ear protection, and I've cut the sound of the machines because all you'd hear is the roar of the dust collector and the whine of the carving tools. Wouldn't make for a very good video. What you see me doing here, and I will say it's at double speed. I think it would be way too long if you watched the roughing out process at regular speed. I slow it down later on when I get to some of the finer details, but initially I had it set at double speed. I think this is actually, this part with the die grinder here, this part is actually at the real speed. This is a DeWalt cutout tool sold in hardware stores. It's really very inexpensive for the tool that it is. I love this tool, but of course I have large hands. I'm afraid that somebody else with smaller hands might not find it so effective, and you'd be forced to look for something that was smaller. They make tools that have the motor hung on a strap and then kind of a flexible cord bringing power to the tool. I've never been able to get used to those things. I always felt like my tool wanted to go a different direction than I wanted it to. So I've always liked tools that are very direct, even though they're a little large and take some getting used to. The bit I'm using on my die grinder here is a structured carbide bit, medium grit, and it also takes the wood off as a fine dust. Of course, I'll say that it doesn't work that way if you're trying to use a wood like basswood. But with cedar that gets very brittle and dry, it's a very effective tool, especially for roughing out. I have versions of this bit for the large 1/4-inch shaft tool that you see here. I'll also be using an 1/8-inch shaft tool. I'm not sure what brand it is, but similar to a Dremel tool. The 1/8-inch bit has the identical bit except half the size. I'll use it for the detail work. Right now I'm doing the cutout, the rough out work on the piece. This is really the heart of carving as far as I'm concerned. This is, for me, the most fun part. When I'm done with the rough out, it's just really basically cleanup. This is the part that I also like to do very quickly, because I began my art career as a potter, and working with clay, I learned to work quickly because, of course, if you don't, then you struggle with the clay drying out. So when I made the switch to wood, I decided it would be nice if I could find tools that allowed me to work at the same pace, the same speed that I was used to working with clay. It's a very different process Of course, clay being usually an additive process, you put stuff on instead of taking stuff off. As in wood carving, you're just removing what doesn't belong. But once you get used to that, it's very similar. A lot of people have suggested, and I tried it a few times, if you have a new project, try doing it in clay first to get a feel for it. I guess I wasn't very happy with that process because the additive process is so different from the subtractive process of carving. It just didn't seem to work for me. I think I've drawn on this piece of cedar a little bit to suggest where I want things to go, but I really don't do that very much on a piece that I've carved many times in the past. And this is certainly a piece that I'm very used to. I know where the various elements of the piece belong, and I'm just trying to fit them into the piece of wood. Some carvers like to say that the wood talks to them and tells them where things want to be. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the wood has a lot to say about what it's going to become. I'm using this piece of eastern white cedar that's cut from a piece of split wood, like a piece you might split for the fireplace. The advantage of that is that the face and the details in the front wind up in the heartwood, which is the very best wood for carving. And the back, which you see is a whiter shade of wood, there you don't need as much detail. You don't care so much. I'm just finishing the rough out here, just putting the final touches on where the various elements are going to go. I apologize, occasionally I forget where the camera is pointed and I move the piece slightly out of the frame. He's mostly roughed in at this point. I'm just going to do some cleanup, then I'll move to my smaller tool. These tools that I'm using are, of course, very aggressive tools. If they're going to be able to take wood off that quickly, they could just as easily take bits of my fingers off just as quickly. I strongly recommend some good leather gloves for anybody using these tools. I find they work a lot better than any kind of fabric glove or any glove with any fabric in it, because the tool, when it hits leather, I've tested it a few times by accident, when it hits leather, it just kind of burns the leather a little bit. But when it hits fabric, it will grab the fabric and wrap it around the tool. And that's not fun. So far, fortunately, I've never managed to really injure myself with my tools, except in the kitchen when I'm not so good with knives and gouges. Maybe that's why I don't use knives and gouges so much. As you can see here, I've switched to my smaller die grinder style tool. Call it a Dremel style, although it's not a Dremel. I believe this one is I'm not sure, might be a Sears. They're all fairly similar. But the important thing is the bit. And the bit is again a structured carbide bit. It's got almost a sandpaper-like surface. Both this one and the larger bit that I was using previously are, I'll call it barrel-shaped. They make them in all various shapes and configurations. The only one that I find useful is this barrel-shaped bit. Using it, you can make a 90-degree cut. I don't find deeper cuts useful, and I rarely find rounded bits useful. Believe me, I have every one that's ever been made, and they all sit on the shelf because the only one that I wind up using is this barrel-shaped bit. The final bit you'll see me using is also a carbide bit, but not a structured carbide bit. It's also barrel shaped, and I think it's an 1/8 inch shaft with 1/4 inch, maybe a 3/8 inch barrel on it. I just basically use it for the cleanup, getting into the cracks and making sure they're sharp and crisp. Most of the work is done with these structured carbide bits. This may be a good time to talk a little bit about the process of carving. When I carve, I like to start first with the face, and the first part of the face, of course, is the nose, the one that sticks out the most. Remember, you can always push the face back, but you can't push the nose forward. If your wood is gone, it's gone. So start with the nose, lay in the rest of the face around that. I always give my hands 4 fingers and a thumb, but I always give my feet 4 toes. Not sure why. Probably has something to do with when I was a youngster, I learned about cartooning, and cartoonists generally do that. I'm really not a perfectionist when it comes to my carving. I preferred that I put just enough detail in to give the effect and not worry so much about the rest. Another little trick that I make use of from time to time is to put a mirror up next to my carving station. And when I'm working on an expression and I just don't know what the mouth does exactly, or the nose does, I can make that expression and look in the mirror. It might be why people say my things look like me frequently, but it's a good tool for you to use. It's not always possible to have somebody handy to ask them to make a certain expression and then study it, but you've always got a mirror handy. Another little tip I'd offer is to look at other people's carvings. Just absorb them. Today with the internet, it's so easy to see not just other carvers in your neck of the woods, but carvers from all over the world. In a lot of cultures, they've been doing this for many, many generations, and they've refined their skills. It's not that you necessarily want to copy what they do in India or in Bali or something, but just notice what they do, notice how they work, and the things that are important will show up in your work as well. One thing I recommend to anyone working in the visual arts is to just draw a lot. Get yourself a sketchbook, some paper, and just draw. It's just a wonderful way of developing ideas without necessarily having to be a great draftsperson. You can just not show your drawings to anybody, but it just helps you develop ideas. It's a lot easier to throw a bad drawing away than it is to start over a oil painting or a wood carving. Speaking of starting over, that's another thing that I recommend people not be afraid to do with wood. With the tools and the wood that I use, I can quite easily expend a piece of wood, throw it away, and start over, because I haven't even if I'm well into it, if it's just not working out, I'm unhappy with it, I just have another piece of firewood. I haven't really invested a whole lot of time and effort into it. This entire video is going to be, I think, about a half an hour long. Now, some of it is sped up, and of course the painting part of it takes considerably longer than the carving part, so I'm only going to show you a small amount of that painting just to get you an idea of what that process is like. But as you can see, it really doesn't take all that long with these tools. So I've moved on here to my final carving tool. It's another Dremel style tool. This one is a Proxon tool. I believe it's made in Germany. very nice tool, very smooth. Must have good bearings in it or something, because it doesn't rattle and vibrate at all like some of the less expensive tools. When I'm doing this finishing work, that's rather more important than when I'm roughing out. A little vibration with the structured carbide tool is not such a big deal, but doing this kind of work, it does help to have a slightly better quality tool. Again, it's a little carbide bit. It's not structured carbide, just a carbide, and it's a little short barrel shape. I just use it to give me sharp lines down in the cracks. Clean up the carving as I go. When I'm finished with this stage of the carving, the next step, I don't think I show it in this video, but the next step I'll go to is with a flap sander. The simple flap sander on the end of a 1/4-inch drill or a drill press allows me to just take off the remaining fuzzies, as I call them, the little bits that you don't want to be there. It's a fairly quick step, but I find it very important. Following that, I'll put on a layer of shellac, which is a wonderful material that helps me harden up the surface. Then I'll go back with the flap sander one more time and do a final cleanup before I actually get to the point where I can start painting it. On the painting on cedar, it's important to put a layer of clear poly on the piece before you start painting, if there's any white in the piece, because cedar has quite a bit of tannin in it, and the tannin will leak through over a period of months or years and turn the white kind of an ugly gold color. So it's best to defeat that going in with a good polyurethane coat. You can use a water-based poly for this, but just make sure that the surface is sealed in that way before you go to the paint. As I'm finishing up the carving here, just doing the details, I'd like to mention one thing about eyes, carving eyes. A lot of people have trouble with eyes, and I worked quite a while trying to figure out the way to carve eyes that suits me best. And what I finally settled on was to define the upper lid in the carving with just an arch, which is easy to do with these tools, but not to put in the lower lid. I let that be developed through the painting process, and you'll see when I get to it at the end of the video here that what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the white on first, then the blue, and then the black. That defines the colors in the eyes, and then I'll put in the upper lid, which is a darker brown, and then the lower lid, the lower portion of the eye, I define with a simple line of flesh-colored paint. You'll see what I'm talking about when I get to it. It's not original with me. A lot of people have settled on that technique. It just seems to work the best, especially when I frequently want my eyes to be smiling and I need them to be narrowed in that respect. I think if you study some of the Hummels that have been done, that's of course not done in wood, it's done in ceramic, but that is a technique that Hummels use as well as a lot of other carvings and sculptures. Just don't try to carve in the lower lid of the eye. It really is difficult to get it done right. I do that when I carve animals, horses, dogs, cows, things like that. I'll say a little more about the eyes. I think it's poets that like to say the eyes are the window to the soul. Well, in my case, the eyes are the window to the expression that I want the piece to have. You can use your mirror to study how your eyes change when you put an angry look on your face, or a happy look, or whimsical look or a sad look. It's the eyes and the eyebrows that change and define what the expression is going to be. I had a friend who was a rather rotund person who, when he would smile and laugh, his eyes would actually close. And I learned from that one of the keys to making the eyes reflect a smile is to close them, give them a lower lid that rises up in an arc similar to the upper lid. If you look at somebody who's smiling, or look at yourself in the mirror as you're smiling, you'll see that this is always the case. Also the eyebrows. Most people can only move the eyebrows together, but not all people, especially certain actors who are well known, had the ability to raise one eyebrow and give a quizzical look. So that's a little technique that I'll frequently use to give my carvings a certain sense of whimsy. Raise one eyebrow, even raise one eye a little above the other. It helps give the carving a delightful kind of expression. As you can see right here, I've just decided I needed to add a belt, so I just kind of carved that in, and I'm just kind of finishing that up at this point. Well, the carving is almost complete here. Just a little bit more cleanup, I think. Then I'll move to the painting portion. And since I'm only showing a little bit of that before we finish, I'll mention that the kinds of paints I use is primarily a simple craft paint available in any craft store. They come in all different colors, and you don't have to labor mixing colors for a particular thing. Occasionally I'll mix something a little different, but mostly it's easier just to use paint right out of the bottle. I always use a layer of poly underneath it and a layer of poly over the top. The paint itself is prone to picking up dust and dirt and grime, so it does need the protection of a layer of poly over the surface. You may not see that right off the bat, but certainly after being handled for a bit, it makes a big difference. Well, as I'm finishing up here, again, I'm going to mention that my next step is to use the Sandoflex sander and sort of take the fuzzies off and soften the surface. Here you can see that a little bit of putting on the shellac, and then I quickly move to having put a layer of white on wherever I'm going to have white hair. And on this one there is no white hair, but on the flesh color underneath the flesh I use a white. And then here quickly I've used a dark blue, and then I put a lighter color over. And I use that technique a lot. I almost never use a light color with a darker blush over it. I don't think that looks good. But I'm putting a lighter blush over the darker color on the coat. Here I'm putting in my first dab of white, and it doesn't really matter that I've gone outside the lines, as it were, because every edge of the white is going to be covered over with paint. And here I'm using the blue after the white is dried, of course. I'm using the blue, and the only line that really matters is the line between the white and the blue. And same with the black. The only line that matters is the line between the black and the blue. Because I'm going to come along now with the brown over the top and the flesh color on the bottom part of the eye to define the edges of the eye. And here you can see I'm putting a brown color on the upper lid, always very important for some reason I don't really understand, but very important to put a brown line over the eye. And now the lower lid to give the eye its expression. I give a nice arc. And you see the eye developing kind of a smile. Finally, I always like to give the eye a little spot of white. I call it a glissande. I don't know if that's a real word, but it's a little bit of sparkle in the eye. Now I'm putting on the blush, which is just a kind of a little reddish flesh tone to bring the skin to life. I wet the surface first and then I brush it on very thinly. And as soon as this portion is dried, I'll go ahead and put a layer of poly. I think I'm using a sanding sealer. Yeah. If I don't put this sanding sealer on, the next step, which you see is applying a stain to the piece, it'll lift the paint off. Here the stain, which is just a brown paint thinned down, just similar to the paint that's already on the piece, but thinned down. And now I'm going to take just some paper towel and wipe it off. I think it really brings the piece to life in this step. First I'm going to use a dry paper towel, and then I'll go to a wet paper towel and just clean it up a little. It has a tendency to give the piece depth, I think. Here's a final layer of poly to protect the surface. I use a flat polyurethane in this case. I think it looks better than a shiny one, a little less plastic looking. And that's it. There's my red hat gnome. Thank you so much for watching, and good luck with your carving or painting or whatever creative thing you're doing.